Yeah, I thought what we'd do is I'll just give some background how we got to this here at LifeBridge. I'm a practitioner. For me, that's just, I tend to think in terms of how's this impacting our local congregation? What do we do to make a difference in that? And just give you just a quick way we got here, and then a little bit of kind of maybe some philosophy about neighboring, and then really get to the practical stuff. Mostly look forward to the Q&A because I realize you're all practitioners, and we're always more interested in, so how do we make this thing work? So yeah, I didn't grow up in the church, grew up in upstate New York. If we ever attended, it was maybe on Christmas. And I remember after I became a Christian and started reading the Bible, there were times I would catch myself going, yeah, did that really happen that way? One of those was in John chapter 5. In John chapter 5, Jesus makes this statement that he, Alan, if you want to flip over to that passage, the passage, the story, the disciples are coming into Jerusalem. They come through the sheep gate, which is a commerce gate, so well-traveled. Pools of Bethesda are there. If you've been there, you've seen what that looks like. And history tells us hundreds of infirm people would lay at this pool, and they'd been there because there was this tradition. Obviously, some healings must have happened, but when the water bubbled, it was an angel who touched the water, and whoever got in the water first would be healed. And so Jesus comes along, and all we get is this verse here in verse 5, all the information. One who was there had been an invalid for 38 years, and Jesus sees him laying there and says to him, do you want to get well? And I'll admit, when I first read that, I thought everything I'd heard about Jesus was he was kind and gracious and generous and compassionate and merciful. And here he is asking what seems to me to be a rude question. Of course, this guy wanted to be well. That's what he was doing. That's why he was at the pool. And then I realized that actually what I thought was a rude question is probably a terrific question. Jesus says to him, do you want to get well? And he responds with, well, I would if I could, but I can't, so I'm not. Every time I try to get in the water, somebody gets down ahead of me. It's not my fault I'm this way. So I've been doing this people thing like a whole bunch of you for a long time. And I don't ever have a weekend where I don't have someone come out of one of our services and say to me, man, I want my life to be better. I'd like to fix my anger issue or this addiction problem or my marriage or my job or whatever it might be. And I catch myself saying, yeah, right, you do. What you want is the pain level to go down. When it goes down, you'll go back to doing whatever it was you were doing that got you in this spot. And I think it's a corporate question as well. Everywhere I go, when I'm with pastors, I hear the same stuff, and we're stressed out over how things are changing. We're stressed at what culture looks like in the U.S. I hear the same questions when I'm in other parts of the world, though. How does the church be vibrant and valuable in a culture that seems to have zero interest in the church today? And I think the question we get is, do we really want to get better? Because most of us want to do what we've been doing and double down on that and hope that somehow we'll see different results. And I think the truth is we're in a massive climate change. I live near Boulder, Colorado, Boulder County, the county I'm in. Here in Longmont, we got voted we tied for the least religious county in America. We've had all the stuff that the U.S. deals with it kind of coming in front of time. So the gay marriage issue we did ahead of time. Pot's legal here, just a lot of challenges. And philosophically, we actually see people now not just ambivalent about church, but actually anti-church. And of course, we're seeing that sentiment grow everywhere. So I'm going to give you some basic stats. You guys know all this stuff. North America is the only continent where Christianity isn't growing. Less than half of all churches have added a single person by conversion. 78% of church growth is just swapping sheep around. Not real growth. Click down to the bottom of this slide, Alan. This one is fascinating to me. So if you take boomers, 65% of them are Christians. Gen X, 35%. Millennials, 15%. And the next generation behind them, 4%. So if we just keep going on the path we're going, we aren't going to have this kind of organic growth or natural growth. And to be in that number, that was simply you checking a box saying that you were Christian. The truth is, the bulk of that group really doesn't seem to have a relationship with Jesus. So in every way we measure Christianity in the U.S., we seem to be challenged by it. This one, where our population has grown and we haven't kept pace. We have less people claiming to be Christian with a larger population. 30.5 million people in the last 3 years have declared themselves as done with the church. 7.5 are nearly done. I thought this group was mainly younger and more the consumer types, but when you do the research into the dones today, the average age is 42, and almost all of them served in some capacity with the church. I already mentioned this one about our church growth is just, hey, who's got the latest and greatest and coolest, and so let's grow. That doesn't mean that there aren't churches growing, because there are. But what we're watching is even the committed have less of a connection to the local church. You know the stats, depending on whether you use Barna, Gallup, or Pew, it's either 1.4, 1.6, or 1.8. People who say they're engaged and involved are attending not very often with us. Rick Warren's right. We preach to a parade. We surveyed our group, and the best way to measure that is in your family area, since they have to check in with their kids. So it's not a true representation of everybody in our congregation, but it gave us a snapshot. When we did the first quarter of 2017, we found that people were coming 0.98 times, so less than once a month. We've got some challenges around this. And so when you look at where we're spending our resources, most of those are spent on the weekend services. In fact, the larger the church gets, the more of your time and your budget and your people, your volunteer hours, are geared toward the weekend. We gear up for the weekend, the gathering, and we gear off of coming out of the gathering. And so a couple of years ago, we said, what would happen if we spent as much time focusing on the scattering as we did on the gathering? And that kind of led us down some path. Gallup says that 66% of Americans see the church having little value. And so there were a series of questions this drove me to. One of those was a big one, and if you read Externally Focused Church, you know where we headed with that. But if the church were to disappear, would anybody care? So if the congregation you're a part of, if it were gone, would it matter? 2 summers ago, I had my 2 oldest granddaughters with me. They were 6 and 4 at the time. At Lake of the Ozarks, we were vacationing over there, and my oldest granddaughter, we're sitting on the back deck, and she said, "Hey, Papa, I want to watch a movie. Can I have your iPad?" So she gets on, she types in my code, she goes to Amazon, she downloads a movie, and 3 minutes later, sitting in rural Ozarks, she's watching a movie, and she thinks this is how the world has always been. It's always looked like this. The truth is that there was a time for some of you on here where if you were going to watch Wizard of Oz, you had to watch it the one time in the fall when the major networks showed that movie, or you were hosed for an entire year. Then we went to DVD and VHS, and then the mom and pop. Every little town had a mom and pop rent movies for the weekend, and Blockbuster was smart enough to go out and buy most of those up and roll those up and start their stores, and Blockbuster became the champion for renting movies. And then we went to Redbox, and now we're Netflix and Hulu, and we have all kinds of options. I can watch on my phone whatever I want to watch. I can get content anytime I want to get content. 2 years ago, Blockbuster announced bankruptcy, and 4 months after, they closed over 7,600 stores across North America. And you drive around your town, and you can point to a picture like this and say that, hey, that used to be a Blockbuster. And they were in the movie business, and they missed the turn. And I think if we're not careful, I think we need to rethink and look at what we're doing. And that's really kind of what drove us to all this neighboring. And so I want to step you through what I've seen in my history here at LifeBridge. I shared with our elders 4 years ago that I'd helped our church transition 2 times, and I think I had one more in me before I was done. It helped them do it twice without killing it. What if we tried one more? We went from a traditional model to a more attractional model. I didn't even have the word attractional, but how do we get people who don't come to church to come to church? So we opened up, like you guys have, all the side door stuff, which was support groups, and we doubled down on children's things, and we focused on a lot of ways to get people to show up in our services. And we grew a lot. And I was concerned, though, were we making any difference in our city? And so we shifted, and it was a blurred line, but we went from more attractional to more missional. We called it externally focused because we didn't even know. Alan said it earlier. We were kind of doing missional before it was cool. we started getting involved in the schools and social services, and it's led to a lot of phenomenally cool things that we're still a part of and seeing happen. And that's led us down a natural road to not just how are we doing this corporately, but how are we helping people do this individually? And so we've kind of made this transition to more incarnational, relational. I don't really like the word incarnational or missional because they've been so abused already, and we mean a million different things. But we put it toward, what if we simply got better at the two things Jesus said mattered most? So it led to all these questions. The first was, how can we get people who don't come to church to come to church? The second was, if the church disappeared, would anyone care? The third question for us was, how can we be the best church for our community, not the best church in our community? So we looked at ways that we could really have influence in our city. And now we're asking this question: what if we got better at the two things Jesus said mattered most? What if we love God and love our neighbor? And what if we started measuring around that? Because here's how we measure stuff, right? We all have inputs. So you've got things like your building and facilities and budget and staff. And then there are activities. So all your ministry stuff, just list all those things: children, small groups, men's, women's, the bazillion things that we do in the life of the church. And then we have outputs. We measure how many people came to those things. And most of us stop at this number. I know I do. It's the butts and baptisms, right? That's what we get measured by. And we really shifted to, what if we looked at outcomes? In other words, how do we get to transform lives, change lives? And then really the impact is the multiple effect of those changed lives over time. And that's been a driver for us. We've been trying to measure on these last two pieces. And I'll be honest with you, it's not as easy. It's not as clean. I can dial down on how our attendance is doing by service, by campus, by age group. I can do trend lines and trailing trend lines, but it's hard to measure changed lives, and becoming even more difficult to measure the result of changed lives. But it happens, and I think neighboring for us is simply a path towards helping people live out their faith. There's a line that I've been using for a long time, that each of us here, we have a responsibility to take the gospel that never changes to a world that is never, ever going to be the same. And so one of the problems we found with neighboring is this: it's not a program. It's not some 10-week thing we do. I want to love my neighbor. Why? Why do I want to do that? How about in the church? We're going to neighbor as a church. Why are we wanting to say we want to be a neighboring church so that what? So that something can happen. So there's some difference. What are we after as a result? The goal of loving my neighbor for me is how is it that there's going to be some change? And as soon as we try to make this a program, as soon as we try to make our neighbors a project, as soon as we turn this into scalps for us, we create some real issues. So I don't know if you'll jump on into that passage that all of us know, in Matthew chapter 22. Jesus gets asked the question, what's the greatest commandment? The reason it was a trap was because there are 613 commands and no one could agree, and it would identify Jesus with a group, or what rabbi philosophy he followed, or what part of the country he was in. And he gives that statement: love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, and mind. And the second's like it: love your neighbor yourself. But I love what Jesus says next, that all the law and all the prophets hang on these two commands. In other words, everything God has said up to this point, every command he's given, every promise he's made, everything the prophets have said, it all hangs on these two things. And the truth is, God's always moved towards us. So if I were to take this philosophically, if you just trace what God did through Scripture in Genesis chapter 1, God was hovering over the earth, over the surface of the deep, and he was hovering. And then you find in Exodus chapter 19, God moves towards us. I'm going to come to you in a dense cloud, he says to Moses. I'm going to be there on the mountaintop. And then he moves a little further, and God lives in the first mobile home here, as he lived in the tabernacle. And wherever the tabernacle went, there was God's presence. People could see the tabernacle. They had access. They couldn't get in, but God was getting closer to them. Then you get to John chapter 1, verse 14. Word becomes flesh, makes his dwelling among us. I love how Peterson in the Message said that. And God moved into the neighborhood. And what we've seen in the glory of his grace and his truth. And yet God moves even further. And Paul tells us, don't you know that you yourselves are God's temple? And he makes his dwelling in you. And so if we're following God, not only has he moved into our neighborhood, but he's moved into our lives. And the best chance I think you and I have for reaching people in our community is through relationship. That's always been true. But what about those relationships of people? What if people were actually carrying out this gospel? So that's what's led us to this neighboring path. And I think that it's on its way to what's next for the church. Brian Mavis, who co-authored Neighboring Church with us, with me, he makes a great line. He said this: every time there's a climate change in the history of the world, every organism in that climate has to adapt or it dies. And I think we're seeing a climate change. And so we've been focusing on this. We've had more failure than success. We found this to be phenomenally challenging for us and yet rewarding. And I think this is the next big thing in the life of the Big C Church. And I don't think it's just here for us in North America. I think that's what we're seeing happening around the world. What would happen if we actually got better at these two things Jesus said matter most: love God and love your neighbor? Because everything Jesus said hinges on those. And if you want the door of our lives, the doors of our church to swing more freely, I think we got to hinge off both. And so we've been pushing on neighboring. Some of you are familiar with Dave Runyon and Jay Pathak, and they do this thing called the neighboring map. If you've never done this, I would suggest you do it sometime. I refer to this as the sheet of shame. We do this in our church 2 or 3 times a year just to see where we're at. But here's what we do. Where the X is, that's your home. And however where you live is configured, whether you live in a condo complex or you live in a rural part of the world, or you're in a city or a cul-de-sac or a suburb, the 8 closest neighbors you have. Here's 3 questions we ask. Can you tell us the names of the people who live in those houses? Can you give us their names? And here's what I learned about me. I thought I was a really good neighbor. I smiled, I waved to people, I kind of knew you generally. We kept our grass cut, our dog didn't crap in your yard, our kids kept the music down when we were gone, I think. At least the cops never showed up. But I didn't know my neighbors. When I went back 5 years ago, we didn't know our neighbors. And so, do you know the neighbors' names? The second question we ask is, tell us something about them. He works for IBM. She's a doctor. They moved here from New York. She's a single mom. Whatever that is, tell us some information. So name their names, give us some information. And the third question we ask is, tell us some hope or hurt or dream they have. Tell us something going on in their lives. Maybe one of them's been sick. Maybe they're getting ready to make a job transition. And the reason I call this the sheet of shame is the very first time I did this, I failed miserably at this. I remember sitting in my home. We had invited our elders and our key staff to my house, and we did this exercise with our spouses together, all of us. And my wife Diane actually had a way better handle on this than I did. I didn't know the people that lived around me. In fact, here's what I found out about me: that I was doing ministry. I would get in my car, open my garage door, back down the driveway, head out of my neighborhood, and go do ministry. And my house is where I slept and kept my stuff. I might wave at you, but I didn't know my neighbors. And so we committed with our leadership team that before we ever asked our church to do this, I think leaders go first. Always have thought that. And so we were going to commit ourselves to being better neighbors, just be better neighbors. However that looked like for us, whatever that meant to us, we didn't have real interpretation for it at the time. But let's just be better neighbors ourselves. We were going to do that for a year before we asked anybody in our church to get better at this neighboring path. And so when we did that for us, it was a game changer in how I saw things unfolding for me personally. So while I don't know if I would fill this out accurately, completely today, I can tell you that I do know my neighbors' names. And for the bulk of those homes, I can tell you something about them. And now I know some things about my neighbor. I know our neighbors across the street are being challenged relationally, and it kind of comes because they're a blended family. And we've had a lot of conversation about what that looks like. And our neighbor's next door, he's just recently retired from the FAA and sat at dinner the other night in our home and talked about what does that look like for him and what's next. And I have neighbors ask me to pray for stuff for them, and they never used to get uh, uh, this kind of request. I don't know if I'm a better neighbor or not, to be honest. I do know that I've worked harder at doing what Jesus said he cared about a ton. What if we actually loved our real neighbors, our actual neighbors? So what it's led to for us is 4 habits, 4 practices that we've tried to encourage our people to do. And so this is some of the practical stuff. And then I'm going to really get to some stuff of why it's hard for us to do this in the church. It's tough to do this because you're trying to get them to do something organic. And how do you do from organic to mechanics? And there's a challenge around that. It's not easy to measure this, but here are the 4 practices we've invited people to. First, we ask you to stay. We ask you to get to know the people, get connected in your neighborhood, stay connected. And the 4 words I'm going to give you, these 4 practices, they rhyme. And I'm not that cheesy. I hate that kind of stuff, but we found it actually has made sense. And it came out of something Brian Mavis was doing with his girls when they were young about what it meant to be a part of their family. And so stay was the first one. Let's be a people who love our neighbors by getting to know them. So we ask people, just learn who your neighbors are. Learn their names. Just find out something about them. And so here's one of the things that's happened for me. I've got a new rule now. If when I come home, someone is outside, I don't go inside. So I don't just pull in my garage, wave, and head on in. I'll go down the driveway. I'll chat it up. Not for long. It's like not some big project. But if someone's outside when I get home, I just made a commitment 3 years ago that I wasn't going to go inside. And those simple driveway, backyard, side yard conversations have turned into me a relationship with some of my neighbors that I only knew by sight, maybe 1 or 2 by name. In fact, I found out I was calling one of our neighbors the wrong name. That's how bad it was. So we want to turn hey yo into hey Joe. How can we just get connected by knowing who's in our neighborhood? The second practice is to pray. What if we were praying for our neighbors? What would that look like? And here's one of the challenges we give people. Pray for your neighbors, not that they might become Christians. That's certainly something worthy to pray for. But pray for your neighbors because you are a Christian. And we're invited to be praying. And so, but here's what I learned about me. There was only so long I could pray for my neighbor who had the loud dog, or the guy whose kids created havoc in our neighborhood, or praying for those people who live in the yellow house. Now I'm learning to be able to pray more specifically for our neighbors about things they've got going on, challenges in their life, invitation. I got a text from one of our neighbors recently, said, hey, while we were out talking, I forgot to ask you, hey, pray for our son. He's getting ready for a job change. And what I know is that stuff didn't used to happen to me, and now it is happening to me. Again, doesn't mean I'm necessarily a better neighbor. What it has meant for me is I've grown in my heart for the people who live in my own neighborhood. And then we talk about play. Hospitality is a huge aspect for us. That word hospitality comes from a combination of 2 Greek words. The first, phileo, we know, means friend or brother, in the city of Philadelphia, brotherly love. And nexia, which nexus is stranger. So in other words, hospitality is make a stranger feel like family. And my wife has a huge gift for hospitality. She's great at having people over. If it were up to me, no one would get invited. I don't have this gift. And I use that as a long time for my excuse. Well, that's just not my gift. I'm not good at that. It's not what I'm wired for. But the truth is, just because I don't have the gift doesn't mean that I'm not invited to practice hospitality. And one of the best ways to do that is to play. And when you look at Jesus, there are 3 purpose statements in the Gospels about Jesus. We find that for the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve in Mark chapter 10 and give his life. In Luke chapter 19, he came to seek and to save that which was lost. And then Luke 7 tells us that he came eating and drinking, that he hung out with tax collectors and sinners. He was called a glutton and a drunkard. Jesus, if you go through Luke, if you trace Jesus' journey in Luke, he was either at a meal, going to a meal, or coming from a meal almost all the time. And in that day, we know, in that century, that was validating. That was saying this person has worth. I'm going to have a meal with you. I'm going to share across the table. I'm going to break bread with you. That I'm assigning value to you. And so are you playing in your neighborhood? I think Jesus was put to death for his table manners, actually. They didn't like who he was hanging out with. And are we finding ways to have somebody over for a meal, to hang out in the backyard, to do a barbecue, to go to a game together, what are the ways that you're engaged in hospitality? And then the last step for us that we talk about, the last practice, is say. Because here's what I know: eventually people are going to ask you about what you care about. And here's what one of the things that we've been trying to help our own people figure out was, for a long time, I wanted to be interesting to people. So when I meet somebody, I'd want them to know my story or tell a joke or find a way that I would be interesting. And we've tried to learn to be more interested than interesting. So we've been helping our people learn to ask better questions. Tell us one childhood dream you had that you're still hoping happens, or what's one thing that's happened to you that just scared the life out of you, or how did you guys meet, or maybe what is it about kids that you think they ought to know the most? Ask questions that open the door. And what we're finding is eventually we get a chance to talk about our story. Eventually we get to share our faith. But again, for us, this isn't about how do we make our neighbors a project. How is it that we get another scalp, we get to lead them to Christ, and now we get to add more numbers to the church? We're not asking people to do that. We hope that is a path that eventually happens for them. We're just asking our people to do this one thing Jesus invited us to do, which was to care about their neighbors, their actual neighbors. So here's what happens. You're going to get people in the church to go, yeah, but I spend more time at work than what I do in my neighborhood. So my people I work with are actually my neighbors. That's true. They are. That doesn't get you out of loving your neighbors. Or, I don't really get along with one of those neighbors. I get that. I've got a challenging neighbor in my own neighborhood that I wish this were easier with. But one of the challenges we found for the church is, because this really isn't a program and there's not a lot of ways to measure this, we think what's different or difficult to neighboring, and Alan, if you'll flip up just here to the next screen. One, it's not on campus, so it's not something that people are coming to. I get to count what happens here when we have a big thing for single moms here on Wednesday night. So I know that we'll have a couple hundred single moms and their kids here tonight, and we can measure that. We can see that. It's a come to. It's here on our campus. We know neighboring isn't staff designed or even implemented. Now all of our ministries do some neighboring things. We're asking everybody themselves to be a neighbor, but there isn't like a neighboring program that one part of our ministry is driving, and they're the ones helping us do neighboring while somebody else is doing children's ministry and somebody else is doing recovery ministry. It's not how that one works. And so there's some challenge. Here's the biggest one. It's not date, time, or place oriented. In other words, people neighbor whenever they neighbor. And we have no way to know if they're doing that or if they're doing that well. What we do is we try to tell stories. What we try to have happen is we share practices. We'll give people 100 ideas around how to stay connected. We'll give them 50 ways to pray, or 75 ways you can play in your neighborhood, or here's 100 ways you can get a starter conversation going about why faith matters for you. We obviously provide tools and practices, but we have no way to really know for sure if they're being implemented or not. So I haven't seen the church blow up in growth as a result of this. I haven't seen a great way for us to know. What I have seen is that more and more and more people are raising their hands saying, hey, I'm going to get better at these two things, loving God and loving our neighbor. What we have seen is a way for people to, we've had stories of stuff that has happened in the neighborhood that would have never happened if the church had tried to show up to do that. What we have seen is our own people get more engaged in the life of their neighbors. And I will tell you, I've also seen some of those neighbors showing up with them at church sometime, or us getting asked, hey, one of our neighbors is struggling with marriage stuff. Are there some resources we could steer them to? Or neighbors saying, hey, our family ministry has some things that we think might help your kids. Here's some resources. That's happening for us more than ever. Alan, go ahead and go to that slide, because I think that's so what we've seen is our senior leadership team, our SLT and our staff, here's the things we do. We create and implement ministry programming. Here are the things we do. We can focus on those things. It's for the church family. They attend or serve or participate. It's on campus or it's off campus in this location. And we have a limited number of people that in our city we know we can reach. But if we could get every home, and we do measure this, where are all the people, where do they live, not only in our own city, but the other communities we draw from, what neighborhoods are they part of, have we connected them together as neighbors? We pay attention to that. But the number of people that are in a loving reach of the life of your church is, if you took 4 homes or 6 homes or 8 homes of every family in your church, they're within loving reach. Your ability to minister to people is exponential at that point. The problem we have is we don't have a lot of control over that. We don't always know who's doing it, and we haven't always sorted out if it's being accomplished in the way we want. And so the mechanics around this are where there's some challenge, because you're calling something to people that is really more deeper in their own life. But when we've watched people grab a hold of this, we've actually seen a lot of things happen in those neighborhoods. And the reason I think this is a God wave is because almost every time there's been a God wave in the past, happened with missional, happened when there was all the attractional things of churches growing larger than 1,000, and the day when that didn't happen, is that there were things that were happening in a secular way that were also going on. And we're seeing that with neighboring. There's rarely a city in America today that doesn't have money related for doing neighborhood community events, do a block party. Our city will pay for you to do that. We actually work with our city on neighboring. So we have some ways we measure neighborhoods, and I'm glad to talk about that in the next little bit here. But I thought I'd stop here because I know when I'm doing this kind of thing, what I want to know is, hey, give me some, here's a challenge. What do you find around that? So I'm open to whatever questions you've got. Hope this got you at least started down this path of how we've gotten to this.
All right. So if you have a question for Rick, go ahead in the chat window. Go ahead and write your question in there, and then I'll be facilitating those questions. It's been interesting, Rick, just as I, reading the Neighboring Church book and hearing some of the stories of how people have gotten involved with their neighbors, and then, kind of what that's led to. I remember one story, I believe it's in the book, of the gal that got to know an elderly neighbor whose wife had passed, and they became friends. She spent a lot of time, almost like part of the family. And one day she was checking in on him and discovered that he had passed out. And so called 911. The ambulance came, picked him up, took him to the hospital, and she was giving his medical history to the staff there. And the doctor said, "Oh, are you a relative?" And she said, "No, I'm just his neighbor." And then the doctor said, "Would you be my neighbor?" And I think that's such a profound, story. So a couple questions coming in. And I know several have been sending messages about whether or not they could get the slides. And yes, you can get the slides as well as a recording of the webinar for those of you who have writer's cramp, we'll have a healing service immediately following the webinar. Jeremy asked, how did you begin training leaders to think and act this way?
Well, one of the things that I've always been committed to is this idea that leaders go first. And so we did that first initial thing at my house with the neighboring map. And then we sat down as a staff and a leadership team, and we just started holding each other accountable to neighboring. We did some Bible studies around this idea of this greatest commandment that God gives, of love God, love your neighbor. We talked about how could we define what were the love God things in our lives, what were the love neighbor things in our lives, and obviously there's a lot of overlap of those, but we even define our ministries that way here at the church. We have things that are more specifically focused toward love God, like Rooted, and yet Rooted has a lot of practical stuff in it. But we also have a love neighbor small group thing that we take people through to give them some of the why this matters. What we want to do is help people develop the heart that God has for people. We want you to have that same heart. So we spent a year just committed to being a better neighbor and did some practices around that. And we would just share stories and ideas. But I think leaders have to go first on this. It's one thing for us to get up and do a 6-week message series. And of course, when we rolled it out to the church, that's what we did. We did a message series. We invited people in neighboring. We have a texting platform for everybody who has said yes to neighboring, and once or twice a week they get some kind of encouragement about neighboring. We do a thing called Plus Ones that I think's been helpful to people, and I'm glad to unpack that if you want at some time, Alan. But it started with our leaders just saying, hey, we're going to do this ourselves. And here's what we found. Not everybody wants to, because it's actually like, it's a little easier to actually go on one of our short-term missions trip than it is to go across the street.
Mm-hmm. Because you have to see them all the time.
Well, you're stuck then. Yeah.
Short-term mission, it's bye, see you in heaven.
And nobody, we've had people who have done the Amway thing, and if you're in Amway, God bless you on that. I'm not shooting at it, but they had people over for dessert. And then they got out hey, here's why we care about our church and care about Jesus, and did that little pitch thing. And we're saying to our people, no, that's not. Yeah. Don't start there. Don't start there. Be a good neighbor, because you've been invited to be a good neighbor.
So Sam asked a question.
Here's the question we ask you. Here's the question we're saying to people. When I started with the more missional, externally focused side, the question was, if our church disappeared, would anybody care? So now here's the burden I have. If I left my neighborhood, would it matter to anybody? Mm-hmm. And if not, how come?
That's a good point. Sam asked a question. It's kind of a follow-up to that. He says, can you give examples of what rolling out the neighboring initiative looked like, and some examples of how you sustain the idea as months or years go by? Because, you and I both know we've had so many things. Oh, here's the new, shiny thing. Oh, let's go chase that. We do it for 6 weeks, and then that's done, and then what's next? And I think pastors are kind of weary of that. So how you launch this, and then how do you keep it going? How do you keep it on the forefront?
Yeah, and again, there's where some real challenges, but also I think opportunity in this. So we've all done the 40 days of whatever, and we've certainly done our share of those. One of the things we do is we talk about neighboring a lot. We create neighboring as a value, not as a program. We ask our staff to make sure that neighboring is regularly showing up in there. So children's are challenged around what we're doing in neighboring. Our worship team just had a meeting, and some of the things, one of the questions they got, hey, tell us some of your neighboring stories. So we tell a lot of stories. We do message series around this. We do a small group thing that we take people through on neighboring. We encourage our small groups to be more neighborhood centric. We didn't blow up our other small groups in the process of this, but we do make them neighboring centric. And we ask our small group leaders to be asking the question, hey, at the end of every week, ask people how you're doing in your neighboring. What can I pray for your neighbors? So we keep it up in front as a value all the time. And we talk about grace, discover grace, grow in grace, live gracefully. That's language we use, verbiage we use here at LifeBridge. And when we talk about the live gracefully, we're saying, how are you doing that in your neighborhood? So this weekend, we're doing a series through the summer on connection. And this week it's about connecting to people. And part of that message would be about, so how are you connecting to your neighbors? So we just try to keep it in front all the time.
That's good. Jeff has a question about how small groups been organized around the concept of neighboring.
So like everybody, we've had 800 versions of what we do with small groups, and we're fixing that now because we've hired Alan to help us fix that. But for us, small groups, we're making as many of our small groups more neighborhood centric than we were interest centric. Because like you, we had the same challenge. The guy that wants to sign up for a small group, but he can only do it Tuesdays at 3 a.m. with guys who smoke cigars and like riding motorcycles. And we don't have a group for them. And so we've said, hey, we want you to get involved in a neighborhood group. And so we've tried to make our groups more neighborhood centric. The second is, as we've taken people through Rooted, we do a follow-on about, we see that as kind of the love God step, and then we do a follow-on small group series with the same group on loving your neighbor. And we're just early in this. I'm excited to see if it has traction for us, but we've seen some stickiness around that we think that is working for us.
And those of you who aren't
early on, oh, go ahead, Alan.
Say those of you who aren't familiar with Rooted, it is a discipleship pathway that Mariners Church out in California brought over from Kenya. And if you want more information on Rooted, you can go to experiencerooted.org, and you can hear more about that. But as Rick's saying, the Rooted is the love God part, and the neighboring is the love your neighbor part. And so that's kind of an interesting trade-off there, a partnership there of one flowing into the other, because I think that we're all pretty much tired of, let's do a really great Bible study, and then the end of it is, wow, that was awesome, we can't wait to the next one. I mean, I'm to the point in life, and maybe it's because of my age, but I'm to the point where if people just say, oh yeah, that was really good, I can't wait to the next thing we have, I count that as a failure. Because how has it changed their attitude? How has it changed the way they're living? How has it impacted the community? And if we're not doing things there, I mean, Howard Hendricks said that we're all educated well beyond our level of obedience. And so we don't need to learn anymore. We just need to do what we've already learned. Now I'm preaching, Rick. Am I allowed to preach on these things? I don't know. Uh-oh, we lost your audio. Let me see what's going on. Well, everything's good on this end. Did something change on your end, Rick? Technology. You got to love it. All right. Well, we're going to take some more questions in a minute. I'm not sure what happened, but I want to talk to you a little bit about some resources that we've developed. There is a growing group of churches around the country that are part of what's known as the Neighborhood Collective. This includes like Oak Hills in San Antonio, where Randy Frazee is on staff, and they've done a lot of pioneering. There are a group of about 20 churches in Austin, Texas that have partnered together and are neighboring there, as well as churches out in Arizona, different parts of the country, as well as the folks that have developed the art of neighboring. And so we have a few other things that, as the thinking and the practice has gone. So one is the book that Rick mentioned that he co-authored with Brian Mavis, who at one time was on staff at LifeBridge, called The Neighboring Church. And so this is a good resource for those of you who are on the call. It's available on the website. It's called theneighboringlife.com, or you can get it on Amazon or anywhere else. We've gone along with this in order to teach your staff about neighboring and kind of get them on board, get everybody on the same page, is that we have a companion study called Becoming a Neighboring Church. And so the idea is that everybody would read a chapter of the book. They would have a discussion with the study guide. And then there's a DVD. There's also streaming video available as well of stories from different people. And there's a whole session with Randy Frazee. There's a whole session with Dave Runyon and a number of other people who've kind of been significant thought leaders in the neighboring movement, and something to encourage your team. And then when you're ready to launch this in your church, and I know several of you had questions in this regard, we created a small group study called The Neighboring Life. and Brian and Rick are featured on the video. It's a 6-week study, but the idea is that your current small groups would serve as a support group for those who want to try neighboring for the first time. And so each week they're going to choose an assignment, and maybe the first assignment is get to know the name of a neighbor that you haven't met before. And then the next week at the meeting, one of the first questions that's going to be asked is, hey, last week you chose an assignment. Tell us how that went. And so maybe they have a good story of, I met this neighbor and we have a lot in common, and glad we finally had an opportunity. Or maybe the story is, you know what, everybody gets in their garages so fast I didn't have a chance to meet anybody, but I'm praying for an opportunity for the next week. And so this is something that you can do either with your current small groups. You can do it church-wide. Anyway, I want you to check out the neighboringlife.com, and we actually have a starter kit on there with one of each of those resources available. You can go on there and just neighboringlife.com and read more about neighboring, as well as what's going on with we're trying to communicate about this audio issue. What's going on in general in the neighboring community, the neighboring movement, as well as other resources that are available to you that you can effectively neighbor in your community. So, Rick, we still have. Are you back, or you're here? Boy, I don't know what happened. It was all working well till I started talking. Let's see. Let me make sure there's nothing on this end. Boy, I sure don't know. Well, that's strange. I apologize, folks. I don't know what happened. Somebody suggests maybe Rick, you should log out and log back in, and maybe that will correct the issue. So if you want to do that, I'll go ahead and answer a few questions, and then if I get everybody confused, then I'll let you clean up the mess. It's fair enough? All right. All right, so let's go on with some questions here. Hello?
Am I back?
Hey, you're back. Welcome
Awesome.
back.
Great. Sorry about that. I don't know.
I don't know. You know, technology, how it goes. Sometimes it goes, sometimes it doesn't. All right.
Sorry about that.
So Jeff is asking, well, maybe I answer the question. How have small groups been organized? I think we got that one already. David says, how could we find out if our city would support a block party? And if they do, are we allowed to share our faith openly? What does that look like when you talk about? Because, I mean, obviously, if anybody's going to be strict about this, it's going to be Boulder County.
Yeah, so we have both in the cities where we have a presence. Longmont, for example, has someone who their actual title has to do with neighboring. I think it's neighborhood management or something like that. So there are grants you can apply for to do a block party, and no, it can't be any sponsored event. So it's not like SPCA can come in and do their thing, or Rotary Club. It's just a chance to get your neighbors together. And again, for us, I think that's the key, is create the relational bridges, because everything happens by relationship. Now, it's funny, the city calls us regularly to help deal with neighborhood issues. So every city, the way to find out how the city views your neighborhoods is just figure out where all the elementary schools are. Elementary schools are neighborhood schools in every city. Middle school feeds up, high school feeds up, everything feeds up into those. But the neighborhoods are almost always defined by where the elementary schools are. So that's where we started. What we've done is we've tried to get somebody to own every neighborhood. So we get some volunteer leaders who work alongside us to say, hey, I'm going to care about this neighborhood. And then they're the ones who vest in people who in those neighborhoods have said yes to neighboring for us. And we try to give them best practices and ideas, and we get neighbors together. But when we're using city resources for a block party or something, it's just a relationship-based thing. We started this rule almost 20 years ago when we started doing stuff in the public schools. We provide 75% of the mentors in the public school system. we provide over half of the homes for foster care stuff, some things like that. What we've discovered is when we're in their house, we play by their rules. When they're in our house, they play by our rules. And so what we encourage is build the relationship bridges, and there are some opportunities and resources available for that. But it's almost always under the Department of Public Safety. Somewhere in that space in each city is where neighboring tends to land. It was interesting, the mayor of one of our local cities was meeting with some pastor friends of ours, and he basically said, if people would just neighbor better, 80% of our issues would go down. And so, you know, I think it's an indictment a bit on the church that we haven't been as strong about neighboring. When it comes to rolling out, one additional thing I was going to say with that, so we've looked at shifting events. For example, our children's ministry used to do this massive Easter, pre-Easter egg hunt thing. It was a breakfast, and we'd have several thousand kids show up for that. It was a big deal. In the last couple of years, what we've done is we've created neighborhood kits for you to host your own Easter egg hunt, either in a park near you or get your neighbors together to do that. And we've done that the last 2 years. And what we found is we actually had total more people attending that, but you would never know that because it was 30 here and 50 there. What I miss about this is when we were doing the big stories about externally focused, our church getting involved in the schools or car clinics for single moms in our city, we could tell these great video stories. We had big stories to tell that impacted a lot. Now we don't have big stories. If you're a good neighbor and some cool thing happens because you did something positive for your neighbor and there was a great story, even a faith connection out of that, that's just one story. What we have to tell today are thousands of little stories, where it used to be we had one big story about thousands. Now we got thousands of little stories about one.
And of course, the trick is you can't tell all of those neighboring stories in church because the neighbor may actually be there with you.
They might come, and if they don't come, somebody tells them.
So that's how that. So we've actually joked about having a website where we could tell other people's neighboring stories from other towns that nobody would have any idea.
Neighboringanonymous.com.
There you go. There you go. Hey, so question about church planning. How do you see neighboring affecting church planning? Do you neighbor first and then start a church, or are you starting, go the traditional route, get the organized mass, and then go to the neighbor? What's some thinking along that line?
Well, we've been working with a lot of church planners around this, and I think you could go either way on how you start. What we've always encouraged when we've opened a campus or done a church plant, we always led with our engagement in the city ahead of that time. So serving in the schools, finding ways to get plugged in, that created the way to get a mass to show up, that, you know, whatever that volume was, get the first 100 people to come to something. Either way, if you instill neighboring as a value from day one, if you looked at how is it that we want this to show up every day, all day, and that this is an important part of who we are as a church. One of the hard parts when you're planning a church is, you know, you're looking for bodies. You need bodies to fill the space and volunteers and all that. So if your neighbors early on figure out that all you're doing is recruiting bodies, that probably becomes eventually a challenge. But again, I think there's this natural intuitive thing of how do we get to be better neighbors, and our neighbors create the relation, and hey, here's what we're doing. We've got this service starting. I've seen a number of new churches we've been working with recently have been starting with just inviting the people in their core that they're already starting with to just start having neighbors over for meals and creating those relationship building, and then talking about what they're doing with a new church plant. And I think there's some effectiveness to that.
Yeah, and it's interesting because obviously there are implications in outreach and evangelism on neighboring, but I almost see neighboring as being kind of an individual spiritual practice, almost like a spiritual discipline of I make time to slow down to have a conversation with my neighbor, check in and see how they're doing, and, you know, pray for my neighbor, get to know my neighbor, help, you know, to meet my neighbor's need, so that I'm not thinking about myself all the time. I'm not coming home thinking about how tired I am and how quickly I want to get into the house and connect with my family, that I'm slowing down and saying, hey, there's my neighbor and I haven't talked to him in a while. I'm going to go over and chat with him for a few minutes.
Well,
And
not only that, neighboring is available to everybody.
hmm
So there are some people who can be on stage, lead
hmm
worship, or be in the band or whatever it is. There are some people who have gifts for working with kids. There's some people who can teach. There's some people who can, whatever it is. But you can be 9 or 90 and neighbor. We've tried to make
hmm
the bar so low you can't get under it.
because I mean,
And
even if you live in a rural area and your nearest neighbor is a mile away, um, it's still your neighbor. You may not see him
and
as often, but you'll see him once in a while.
I think what you'll find is the older people in your church, that 65 plus crowd, whoever those folks are,
hmm
they think this is the oddest thing in the world because they've spent their entire lives neighboring. But we're living in a
Exactly.
day today where everybody cocoons. So researchers are telling us that we have more, we are relationally more connected than we've ever been on the face of the planet, but we have less depth of relationship than we've ever had.
hmm
University of Berlin did a study, said that 78% of people after they've been online get off social media and they're angry, frustrated, or depressed because they look at all their friends' lives and their friends are having a great life and they're sitting at home eating mac and cheese with their dog, and so it's there's a need for this. There's a need for deeper relationship connection, and people are hungry for that. And I think this is a door for us. This is an opportunity um, that I think we can take advantage of in the church.
Yeah. Now, Jordana asks a very interesting question, and it's several parts, but how much are you sharing with your church about where they choose to live when considering neighboring? Do you believe proximity to the poor should be a part of this conversation? What are the neighborhoods of your church people, economically speaking? So, I mean,
So great question. And
yeah.
as a church, we a long time ago adopted a heart for the poor. So we do a lot. And so our churches across the board, we have people from every neighborhood, the higher end economic, the lower end economically. Um, we have we cross a lot of lines that way. I think that has mattered to us for a long time. Um, so we don't say, hey, you should move into this neighborhood so you can be a better neighbor in that neighborhood than you are in this neighborhood. We just ask you to start where you are. Now, there are some people who have a real burden for this, and I've watched people move, relocate into more of our economically challenged neighborhoods so they can make a difference. We actually have some intentionality around that we do ministry-wise. But we're not asking you to move to become a better neighbor. We're asking you to start with just be the better neighbor where you are. It's fascinating to me how many people have been challenged by this. Who the idea of actually being a good neighbor is sounds a lot better than it is to actually do it. I've found there's a lot of personal challenge for it, and I feel phenomenally inadequate as a neighbor, and I don't feel like I'm very far down the road on this. Personally,
Yeah.
but I know I'm becoming a better neighbor every day than I used to be.
I remember I was working on a project with McKinney Church in Fort Worth a few years ago, and they were doing neighboring before I even knew what neighboring was, but they did a curriculum called Love Where You Live.
Yep.
And we interviewed a number of couples and individuals in their church about neighboring. And one couple had moved from basically the suburbs of town to kind of the artsy part of town. They wanted, to live in a different place. And moving in, they knew that there would be people around them that had very different lifestyles. A lot of people that, um, homosexual relationships, marriages with children, and very, very different. And yet, what they began to realize was as they were open and accepting of their neighbors were open and accepting of them. And the stories that they could tell of, people knowing that they're Christian, people knowing that they're retired, they're white, they're middle class, all of these sorts of things. That when people had issues, they would come to this couple and they would say, would you pray for me, because I'm dealing with this situation. And it really opened up a lot of avenues to minister and to serve their neighbors. And I remember another story of a guy that he lived in the wrong part of his neighborhood because he felt like the street that he was on, and I remember where the story comes from. I think it's in the book. And so they ended up selling their house and moving to another street so that they could be in a cul-de-sac, because the cul-de-sac was a better place to have activities in your front yard without blocking the street. And so then the cul-de-sac could become kind of where the place was where people would come for a party or whatever else.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of opportunity around this for creativity, for ideas. Move your backyard to your front yard. How do you do that? I think that the real nothing on the planet happens outside of relationship, and so when I'm relationally connected, I have a different opportunity to have conversation than when I'm not relationally connected. Mm-hmm. And so we've just found that this opens the door. What's been fascinating to me, and the reason I know this, that while I feel incredibly challenged, and I think as a church we're still trying to sort out how we're doing this, I have more and more people asking me questions about, so how do I know how to talk about the Bible? How do I know how to talk about faith without being weird with my neighbors? So I know they're being asked, and I know that they're being asked because they're in a relationship. The relationship happens when you're sitting and talking to somebody about their work, and they're talking about what's next for their life. I mean, people are still asking spiritual questions today. They're just not asking the church for answers. They're not looking to the church for those answers. And so that's why I think this matters for us sorting out how we do this.
Yeah, I mean, and the reality is that we are spiritual beings and we have those kinds of issues. We may, people may be getting their information from a TED Talk or from some other kind of inspiring thing that's out there, or Oprah's network or whatever else, but they're asking the same questions that everybody else is asking. They're just, like you're saying, not going to the church for that source of information. Somebody was asking about the Easter idea was one thing of how do you take a large scale event and turn it into smaller things that happen in the community. One thing for me, and it's always a controversy among Christians, but I've always loved Halloween. And the reason I've loved Halloween is, well, first of all, there's a lot of candy. And my kids know that, anything that they bring in, 10% goes to dad. It's the art of tithing, right? But the second thing is my neighbors come to my house and I go to my neighbor's house and I begin to, we have a few houses in the neighborhood that are rentals. And so there are constantly new neighbors at those houses. And so maybe that's the start of a conversation because their kid rang the doorbell and said trick or treat. Now, for some of you, you may have, a problem with that. So don't do this if you have a problem with that. But for me, it's been a good opportunity to get to know my neighbors and, to get my fair share of the candy. So.
Well, and I think we just look at it. It's not that I am trying to get less people to come to church. That's obviously not the case. I want people to show up this weekend, just like everybody else does. What we do look at is how are we spending our resources? How much of those are just on the gathering and how much are on scattering? And we try to look at neighboring as one of the ways we scatter. And so where it used to be that we would encourage you to do something on campus or come to this event on campus, now we're looking for ways, can we do that same thing by taking that out to neighborhoods? Mm-hmm. And so we've done some large stuff in some of the schools, in neighborhood schools. We've used some of the coffee shops and those kinds of things as places to do some things. We've just looked for open doors to pushing ministry. And it's kind of like this. We had that come strategy, right, for a long time. Come to our church. We've got this cool thing going on. Be a part of our church. And then we moved to a go strategy, right? Let's go across the street. Let's do stuff. And now we're looking at more like a be strategy. Mm-hmm. How is it you be the person God intended for you to be? I think I would look at it this way. Google Earth. In fact, that came out of this area. And one of our members is the guy who first drove as a CEO of Digital Globe, and I remember getting one of the first satellite pictures of our city, and then he gave me one of our church parking lot during the week so I could figure out what staff were working and which weren't that day. And so we had the satellite images, then so we had Google Earth, then we went to Google Maps, and now we've got Google Street. And I think that's what we've seen with this for us. It's taking what we care about and just moving it down to a street level and finding as many ways as we can take what we've cared about globally and shoving that down to a street or a personal level.
Yeah, and I think
And
too.
not all of it works that way.
So I think too, because obviously pioneering, externally focused, you've been at this for over 20 years. And I think the thing that I've heard come up from you and your team was the idea of we were serving in a large way. We were getting, the news media was making, mentioning what we were doing and all of that sort of thing. But the thing that was missing was the relationship that we were serving, and that was a good thing. I mean, obviously, from sitting in rows to getting out in the community was a huge step that if every church did that, we'd go a long way. But then the serving went from serving as a project or serving as a single day or what have you to how do we serve individuals?
Well, like, your church does a food drive, I'm sure, so we partner with the local agency that our church helped start a lot of years ago. And we used to have the big tractor trailer sitting out front. We'd stack groceries up and we'd fill it. The last couple of years, what we've done is we ask everyone to take a grocery sack with a list of items that are needed. And then we say, and we want you to take 5 more and give those to your neighbors and ask them, and you become the collection point, and then you take it down to the Hour Center. And it's amazing. Even when there's been global relief efforts, it's amazing now how many neighbors of our church people participate in those, because they'll say things like, well, we know your church is going to help do that. Can we give you money to give to that? And so while we're a long ways from where I hope it goes, I'm seeing some doors and some things kind of beginning to crack open that I think are going to lead to something substantive.
Yeah. And again, there's questions about small groups and neighboring. And so I think you can go 2 ways with this. I think you can take your current small groups, introduce them to neighboring, like what we've done in the Neighboring Life. The other thing is being in conversations with Tom Anthony at Oak Hills in San Antonio is that they've begun to look at the neighborhood as the group. And then the group has meetings. And he said that he even has neighborhoods that have multiple meetings within a neighborhood. So it's more focused on group life than group meetings. But there is the potential. I mean, imagine this in your community, and I know we have communities represented from all over the country here, that if you had a small group made up of people from a neighborhood, in every community in your city, what would that look like? And I know 10 years ago, when I was trying to get this information because my realtor had it, why could the church have it? That there were 1,600 neighborhoods in Greenville, South Carolina. And I thought, wow, we only have 400 groups. We got a long ways to go before we hit 1,600. But at least to track our progress and to say who lives in this area and where is the need and how do we get all of that going. But I think that's how pastors think. We think about the overall strategy of this. But I think what it really comes down to is the individual getting to know a name and praying and being available and being neighborly. And if you like what Rick was saying earlier, if you go back 50, 60 years, this is how people were. They were neighborly because you just were neighborly. And nowadays it's, a bit of a foreign concept. And this applies in different ways. In a rural area, you're not going to have as many neighbors. They're going to be few and far between. In an urban area, you're going to have neighbors stacked on top of each other. And so maybe you take that neighborhood map, and instead of a subdivision, the neighborhood map is a floor of your apartment building. Or, it's a block of brownstones or what have you. You can adapt that any way that you want. Just, don't skew it so that, you include the neighbors and you ignore the neighbors that you don't know just to make yourself look better. That's not going to work. All right, so Greg has a question. Has any church been intentional about designing specific blocks, streets, or neighborhoods and having the members post any visual sign or indicator that they are the person who is praying for the street, neighborhood, etc.? In other words, How could we let our neighbors know that we're praying for those on our street? Would a simple praying for our neighborhood sign in the yard be too much?
That's a great idea. I know some people who have gone as far as creating. In fact, we work at trying to create people who are owning a neighborhood. But I don't know of anybody who's done specifically what you're suggesting, Gray. That's a great concept. I'd love to kind of test that out and see what the response would be on that.
Yeah, I think
We do have some. I do know of what's happened in 3 or 4 neighborhoods around here for us is that they created their own Facebook, neighborhood Facebook, where people could post things. Hey, we have this need, or we've got pray about this. There's a prayer section in there, and it's worked for them. It's an idea we've been asking other neighbors to try in their own neighborhoods, but not had anything like you're suggesting with the sign out in the front. It might be a great idea.
could be. All right. Well, I know we're a little past the hour we committed to. A lot of you have stayed on. If you need to go, we're going to kind of officially conclude. But if you have a question we haven't addressed, I can stick around for a few minutes. Rick, I know your schedule. Are you good for a few minutes? You need to run.
I've got just a couple of them, but then I have to scoop. But yeah, thanks for joining us today, and love to hear your ideas at neighboringlife.com. We're trying to post best practices and ideas, and we're early in on this, and been doing it for 3 or 4 years, learning a lot, but got a long ways to go.
Yeah. Well, somebody's got to be the guinea pig, Rick. So.
Well, there's others out there.
There are indeed. All right. Well, I'm not seeing any more questions, but thank you all for joining us today. And if you have any questions, visit us at theneighboringlife.com, or you can shoot me an email. You guys have my email address. I spam you all the time, so you have my email address. But anyway, thank you for joining us, and consider this. This is something. If your fall's already planned, maybe this is a way to kick off your new year. But again, a way that any member of your congregation can get involved in serving other people. No special talent required. Anybody can be a neighbor. It's just a matter of slowing down and paying attention and focusing on maybe this is my mission field, and it starts right when I step out my front door, right when I pull my car out of the garage, and a great way to serve. And so I honestly, I believe this is the future of ministry. I think a lot of our overt attempts at ministry, I think they're still available in some areas. But as I'm working with churches across North America, I'm seeing more and more resistance to things. And I'm not going to be Mr. Doom and Gloom, even though people think that my glass is not only half full, but it's also cracked and leaking. But anyway, but what I am seeing is that if overt sorts of things of reaching a community is not working, then maybe we start this, and I will label it as more of a covert way of doing things, because you can't keep neighbors from talking to each other, and you can't encourage people to do good, encourage people to reach their neighbors, and hopefully when they see that there's something authentic here, their neighbor is not a project, it's a genuineness in a person's heart of getting to know them, and then them being familiar with someone who has the light of Christ shining in their life. Is going to make a huge difference in a neighborhood and in the life of an individual without forcing it, without it seeming to be rehearsed or anything else. And like we said, this is something that's been new in the works, but I think it's something worth looking into. So God bless you all. Thank you, Rick, for your time.
Say about doing this. So
yeah,
it's been around for a long time. So hey, thanks for joining us.
All right. Thank you, everybody. God bless.